Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, our next speaker will deliver the presentation remotely. So, Professor Jason Patrick Simpers from University of Toronto. So, okay.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, everything is good. So please start. We can see
you. You can see me, you can see the slides, you can hear my voice. Fantastic. First of all, my apologies for not being able to attend. I would have loved to have visited Chongqing. So secondly, I should mention that my colleague, Dr. Han Hao, will be speaking in, I believe, Forum 4 later on this afternoon, and I really strongly suggest that you catch his talk. All right, so my talk's probably going to have a little bit of a different flavor from a lot of the other talks that you've seen today, in that we're in the business of building self-driving labs here at the University of Toronto. This is part of what we do. But once you start to build those wonderful self-driving labs with robots as far as the eye can see, you start to find yourself asking questions about, how do I turn data into information, to knowledge, to wisdom? And where do the biases that I bring along with me as a scientist, where do they sneak into this autonomous AI-driven workflow? And how can they confound me and prevent me from being successful in identifying new materials? So first thing is, when we think about bias, it's one word, but it encapsulates a number of different terms. And so if you look towards the social sciences, if you've done machine learning ever in your life, you've seen the Boston housing market data set. And one of the ways that we encode bias, for instance, in the Boston data set, is in the way that we decide to describe the features of our data, of our material. And so here's an example, for instance, in the Boston housing data set, where they decide that housing price goes as the quadratic of the number of African Americans inside of a particular town. Another way that bias sneaks into AI, again, for social sciences, is in the accuracy of facial recognition techniques, where basically across the board, darker female accuracies are way lower than lighter male or lighter female. And this comes down to the bias of where we've decided to look. And then finally, another way that bias sneaks into data sets is the idea of how we decide to label a data. Is it a high crime area or a low crime area? And what underlies that, right? And so how we describe the system, how we select where to look, and how we label outcomes. All right, why is this bad? This is bad because bias in any of those three categories impacts predictions. And in particular, when we make predictions outside of the distribution of our training set, they could go wild, they could be weird, and sometimes they can be dangerous. One should point out that within the community, we actually, not just our community, the computer science community, there's no really firm definition of what constitutes an out of distribution observation. And so this is a term that's thrown around willy-nilly by the community when there isn't really a firm definition. Okay, so those are social sciences, and I don't care because it doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm a material scientist. There's no bias. Oh my God, there's bias. Where is it? The first place that we find it as material scientists, again, is where we decide to look, our research space. We understand that the space of potential materials and of processings, of ways of bringing things together and characterizing them, is functionally infinite. but we're scared, right? We want to be successful. And so we follow what other people have done, which is domain bias, which then determines for us where we're looking. Once we've decided where to look within our labs, we have the actual data set. These are all the samples, all the measurements that have been made. This space is still relatively large, although now we're beginning to introduce errors in the way that we label data and in the way that we decide to describe things. And then finally, all the way distilled down to what actually makes it into the technical literature. And this is selection bias because we were following what other people did. We want to be successful. We want our Nature paper. And so we only present the best possible results, all positives, no negative results, go to town. Right. And then, of course, on the other side of it, again, it's how we decide to describe materials, right? How we choose to describe microstructure or composition or property, and how we decide that those are important for making predictions. Okay, here's where the bias is. Where is it in the autonomous workflow, and how can we identify it? So, self-driving lab, right? Just real quick, this is a paper Eric Stack, Benji, and a bunch of us wrote a couple of years ago, sort of taking the state of the art of taking the temperature of the state of the art of self-driving labs. And so typically speaking, humans work with computers to initialize experiments, define constraints, what are our objectives, what information can I provide you? The robot is then sort of handed off. The AI then uses that data, trains a model, makes a prediction, uses an acquisition policy to balance between exploration and exploitation, and uses that to decide on what the next experiment to run is. That experiment is carried out. It could be a simulation, could be DFT, could be molecular dynamics, or it could be talking to my physical vapor deposition system and making a thin film sample, deciding upon how to characterize it, generating data and metadata. We then analyze, right? We then take that data and we have a diffraction pattern doesn't mean anything to a robot. Raman spectra don't mean anything to a robot. We have to turn that into something that is AI actionable. And so this is extracting and representing knowledge, interpreting and explaining, reasoning and understanding. This circle completes, sort of goes around in a couple of loops until we reach a point where we've achieved our objective. We conclude, report, and we update the data repository. This is vanilla self-driving lab. And so what I want to dive down into first is, where is bias in how we plan our data? How does that sneak in and how can we mitigate it? So as with all projects, I get to make big, lofty directions, and then these are the people who actually do the work. And so first thing you want to do is show that there is bias in how we decide where to look in data sets. And so there's lots of really cool open data sets, right? But they are themselves biased by the developer's interests. What are they funded to do? And it is possible that the fundamental underpinning of all of the statistical learning models that we use, IID, independent and identically distributed, could be violated even between versions of the same data set. We all use in our AI ML stuff cross-validation to give us a sense of the generalizability of our model, but that doesn't reflect the bias. And if the distribution changes, your predictions go to crap quickly, right? They promote overconfidence. So what are we going to do? We're going to use a graph neural network, which is a state-of-the-art tool for AI, best accuracies. And then we're going to use some traditional ML models like XGBoost and Random Forest. And we're going to see what we can find. So first thing right off the jump is the pre-trained state-of-the-art graph neural network designed by our friends Kamal Chowdhury and Brian DeCoste at NIST, Align, which was trained on MP18, is a terrible predictor in MP21. So you can see on the graph here, the orange dots represent the MP18 data, which are part of our training set. And then our held out MP21 data set, the DFT errors are just all over the map. And they're huge. They are 1 to 3 EV per atom when your mean absolute error for your well-trained model is 20 milli EV per atom. This state-of-the-art model, if the distribution shifts and you don't understand it, is not worth anything. It's as good as a random guess. And if we're in the business of trying to find new materials, once we've trained our model, we're using generative algorithms to try to find what's next to look at. None of those, it is potentially the case that many of those predictions are out of distribution and thus are not useful. Bad news. And this is the same if we look at XGBoost or random forest or linear forest, systematically across the board, going from one version of materials project to the next, the prediction error on new compounds is terrible. But there's this concept of ensemble models, right? Whereby since all of the models are wrong and they all disagree in different proportions, we're going to turn garbage into gold. We're actually going to use the disagreement between the models as signal to find out which samples are likely to be poorly predicted, and thus, if included in the training set, are going to dramatically improve our model's predictive capabilities. So on the left, you can see a reduced dimensional representation of the two data sets, the training and the test set, MP18, MP21. This is in UMAP. It's not particularly important. And what we're going to do is we're going to use active learning principles. We're going to use this ensemble model queried by committee, and
Recording
our
in
ability
progress.
to predict to the future. Good story. Disagreement. Then we have an option of being able to predict new materials and update the model much more rapidly than if we were to do it randomly or just in one big batch. Cool. But what more could we do? So what more we could do is now, if we only needed 2% of the data to get a wonderful, 2% of the new data to get a wonderfully predictive model, how much of the original data did I need? And so, there's this general sense in the community that we need big data to do machine learning. We need millions of models, millions of materials. But that needs big compute to get it, to train it. But do we really need it? So here's what we did. We looked at the 3 largest open materials data sets that we were aware of. OQMD from Northwestern, Materials Project from LBNL, and Jarvis from our friends at NIST. We looked at 3 different properties for each of them: formation energy, band gap, and bulk modulus. And we peeled the onion. Layer by layer, we peeled data point by data point until we got the smallest possible data set we could use and still train a reasonably predictive model. We call this pruning. The results are kind of stunning, honestly. So this is formation energy for Materials Project 21. This is OQMD formation energy, and this is OQMD band gap. And as an experimentalist, first and foremost, an R squared of 0.95 is phenomenal. Computational people tend to like their R squareds to be a bit higher. On the order of 0.98 is reasonable. But you can take 70% of the data out of your training set use only 30% of the data to train, of building AI models, if I'm in the business of acquiring data, I only needed 30% of that data in order to get a good model. 70% of that data is redundant in the context of the model. That's useful information, but it's after the fact information. I've got a data set of 1 million data points. I only needed 100,000 or 200,000. But I've already put the compute in, I'm kind of in a corner. However, if we use, similar to how we're doing here, if we use an ensemble method, right, to intelligently select the data, this orange line represents going backwards, peeling the onion all the way down till we have the minimal amount of data. This green line represents the opposite, starting with 0 data and using the query by committee or the ensemble model approach to continuously build the data set. We're able to very close to the, we are able to use just about the same amount of data. 30 to 40% of the data is sufficient to generate a model that is adequately predictive. I would say comparably as predictive as if we had used the full data set. And so this is an example of bias, right? This is where they were looking, as a result of which this new space is completely not only unmapped, but unpredictable. This is how one method by which we can overcome bias. The second form of bias that we've encountered in our own interactions with our friends sort of sits around chemical intuition, right? You start to work in a new project with a team. They've been working with lithium carbonate. They have a process that takes the brine, softens it, and then uses a dual reactor system to basically selectively crystallize lithium carbonate while getting rid of all of the impurities. They then filter, and they can basically get at scale battery grade lithium carbonate. And so the question that we were asked was, we can do this. We have a pilot plant in Arkansas. It's working. What other brines could we consider? What are the envelope of brines that are possible to consider with our technology? So what we started with, right, was the simplest possible. We're going to GPR, Gaussian process, Bayesian optimize this and get to the answer. We have a set of process control variables. We have some outputs. Our friends have given us some information about what conditions make thermodynamic sense, right? Where we should, what are ranges of the temperatures that we shouldn't consider? And so we were just going to GPR that, generate a response surface, predict our uncertainties, select our next samples with our acquisition policy, right? We're looking for edges here. So we want to find Pareto frontiers. And then select optimal conditions, rerun, and we're going to do this, and we are going to win with machine learning to get our brines. I should point out that each experiment for this, one data point costs 3 days of work. All right, so that's the plan. But 6 months into the project, I'm sitting in a meeting with my colleagues, and this isn't working. We have not yet met spec. We have yet to make battery-grade lithium carbonate with a group that specializes in making battery-grade lithium carbonate. And we're at the point where the relationship is over, right? We're about to take a week off from one another in the process of just going our separate ways. But then something happened. You see, our friends had told us that this cold reactor, they wanted it as cold as possible. They wanted it, room temperature or below, because thermodynamically anything higher plays havoc with the inverse solubility of lithium. But there was a lot of information that was coming out of these experiments, like interrogating through the model, exploring different visualizations, looking at feature importances, and trying to identify Pareto frontiers in the space of what has been done and what could be done. And the student that was working with me kept finding that this T cold gap analysis was saying that T cold wanted to be higher. That was going to get us battery grade lithium carbonate. And look, we're at the point where the relationship's over. And so I bet my colleague one donut, saying, look, it's over anyway. Do this experiment. Please figure this out for us. Tell us that we're wrong, that the model has found a ghost. And we can go our separate ways. You can go back to your thing. I'll do my thing. But let's just try. Next week, after they'd run their experiments, we started making battery grade lithium carbonate by boosting the T cold up 30 or 40 degrees C or higher than they had wanted us to. And since that moment, we have not stopped making battery grade lithium carbonate on demand in their reactor. And so that's cool. That company's in Vancouver. We're in Toronto. I thought it would be years until I saw my donuts. The next morning, there was a bag of donuts hanging on my doorknob, flown in from Vancouver. Okay, so I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I assume someone will stand up and tell me I'm talking too long. Okay, so the next part of the place where we introduce bias is an analysis. The way that we analyze the data coming off of our tools, spectroscopic and imaging, right? We notice. Anyone who's ever looked at a diffraction pattern and said, is that a peak? Anyone who's ever done XPS or looked at someone's XPS and seen like 30 different peaks with a big broad hump underneath of it? Anyone who's ever done any type of spectroscopic measurement and had to ask the question, is that real? Understands that it's a human endeavor. And so, unfortunately for us, those things become the labels or the features that we use to train our models. And so the squishiness is disconcerting at least. And so Runza is basically been over the past year developing a case study on removing human bias from the analysis of electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, or EIS. And so, big picture, how does it work? It uses an evolutionary algorithm called gene expression programming to explore the space of potential equivalent circuit models, and then uses on the other side of it Bayesian inference to get a statistically sound understanding of the importance of each of the individual components in the ECM, and provide the user with both the ECM and all other ECMs that could be there, your sort of standard average R-squareds and MSEs, Bayesian information criteria to balance the complexity of the fitted model to the overall performance, and then posterior distributions and posterior predictions for the individual components. Cool, that's a lot. What does it do? So this is an example of a set of data given to us by a colleague. Through the generative model, we are able to identify two different potential circuits that could fit this data quite well. But in this data set, we have a sort of statistical anomaly. The R2, the second resistor, exhibits a uniform posterior distribution, which basically means that any value of R2 is going to give you the same fit of your data. If every value is the same to the model, none of the values matter, and we can throw that R2 away. And when we do so, we get nice Gaussian distributions for each of the posteriors for each of the components. Cool. We can also do this, for instance, to interrogate models that our colleagues show. So this is EIS on an oxygen evolution reaction. This is the expert preferred solution, which is a double Randall circuit with a series resistor. This is the auto EIS preferred circuit with a single Randall element and a single series resistor. And what we can provide then to our colleague when they're in the process of labeling this data and determining, how many transport processes are occurring is some statistical understanding of, hey, look, these are reasonably nicely Gaussian. There are some divergences in this data. The R squareds are pretty comparable to one another. And likewise, the widely applicable information criteria, which one do you really think supports your data? One of the really cool things is once you have a hammer, you can start finding nails all over the place. And so there's sort of this additional level of bias called sampling bias. If you've done EIS before, or if you've ever had to do a measurement where you had to ask a question of how long do I have to measure until I've measured enough? EIS measures to very low frequencies, like millihertz. And so a single EIS measurement could take an hour, could take an hour and a half if you have to go down to these low frequencies. The question, though, is do you have to go to these low frequencies? And so once you have this sort of strong inference engine underneath it that is brittle to the fact that is sensitive to the inability to no longer detect signal from individual circuits, we were actually able to demonstrate that they could drop 1/3 of the data, in fact, quite a bit of this elephant trunk, reducing their measurement time by 99% and still preserving nice, clear Gaussian posteriors for these elements that are no longer even present to the human eye, but are still there and contained within the signal. Okay, so I'm assuming it's the last couple of seconds. We're doing great things at the University of Toronto through the Acceleration Consortium. We're in the process of building a user facility for self-driving labs for molecular materials discovery. Dr. Han Hao was our first staff scientist hire from this group, but we're building 6 self-driving labs here. Each one of those labs is going to have 5 staff scientists. We also have a specialized AI and automation lab, which is going to take on another 5 staff scientists. So we're looking to hire on the order of 35 to 40 scientists in the next couple of years. If you're passionate about AI, if you enjoy working with materials in diverse environments, if you want to be on the forefront of research, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Han. We would love to talk to you. We'd love to talk to your students. We'd love to bring you all in as staff scientists, and let's build something crazy together. So I'm the idiot. This is my village. These are my friends that work with me. These are the folks in the national labs who still talk to me. These are the folks who have paid for the research that we've done over the past couple of years. These are my conclusions, and I'm sure I'm over. I am happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Okay, thank you, Jason. It's a very nice talk. So it's question time. Any question on this? So Jason, I have a question. So when you compare the QCB query by committee, so it shows that with more data, there's still a little deviation from the optimized curve and the QBC curve. Not this one, the one before you. Oh, this one. So this is the optimal. There's still a deviation from the QBC and the optimal one. So what's the reason for this?
So the way that you can think about this, that's a great question, by the way. The way that you can think about this is delta information, delta data point. no data point provides zero information. Every data point provides some.
Okay.
However, early on, the amount of information you get per data point is very, very large. And soon you sort of reach the asymptote, the point of diminishing returns. And so there's two philosophies, right? The philosophy one is, I want the perfect model.
Mm-hmm.
If you want the perfect model, take all the data. The other philosophy is you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. By the time you're here, you know, you're filling in the last final interstitial sites. You're just getting the last bit of packing in. If you're looking to find new materials, you've got enough information by here to probably have a pretty good understanding of your system.
Okay. Yes. So another question is for the pruning method. So you cut the data. So compared to the QBC, so it's a backward, like a backward. For the QBC, it's a forward one. You increase the number of data points. But this one, it seems you decrease the number of points. So there's a prior that you first need to have a large amount of data, then you cut that down. So in reality, so when we solve a problem, so usually we have very few data. Am I correct?
Yeah. Great question. The two sort of serve a different purpose, right? When I first told like Gert Cedar that I think that a lot of the data in materials project is redundant for modeling, his response was maybe formation energy, but nothing else, right? And so because there's no baseline, you don't know what the most information you could possibly get from a smaller data set that doesn't exist. We had to make it ourselves. So you're right. The pruning is basically establishing the absolute best model you could have based off of this size of data. But in real life, we'd be starting at QBC world, right? We'd be starting with very little data and building.
Right.
And so what we wanted to show here is just that how close to this optimum could we get if we started from zero?
Okay. 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 So any other questions? Okay. So due to the time limitations, thank Jason. Thank you very much for a nice talk. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all for the invitation.
So all our three speakers finished the talks. So let's have a 10 minutes break. So the next session will start at 10:15.